The wind howled through the hollows of the ancient oak, its branches clawing at a sky heavy with unshed rain. At the forest's edge, a figure knelt, his hands bound not with a rope, but with strips of bark inscribed with agam, each groove a word he could no longer speak. The villagers stood behind him in a half circle, their faces lit by torchlight, their silence louder than any curse. They had given him the rites, salt on his tongue, then none. A lock of his hair burned in a clay bowl, his name spoken one last time, then cut from the record of the living. Now only the forest remained, its shadows pooling like spilled ink between the trees. He knew what awaited him there, not death, but something worse. The Fianna who had been cast out before him were said to still wander those depths, their bodies unrotted, their voices stolen by the wind. They were the nameless, the unbelonging, and by dawn he would be one of them. This was the truth of banishment. It was not an end, but an unraveling. The priestess raised her bone flute and played 3 notes, high, low, between, the same sequence used to put mad dogs to sleep. The torches snapped out as one. In the sudden dark he heard the first rustle of leaves where no foot had stepped. Behind him the village gates closed. Before him the forest breathed, and so it began. Banishment in the ancient pagan world was not merely an act of exclusion but a sacred severing, a ritualized removal of threats, both human and supernatural. To be cast out was to be stripped of one's place in the community, the god's favor, or even the natural order itself. The reasons for such expulsions were as varied as the cultures that practiced them, yet a common thread ran through them all: the belief that certain forces, whether mortal criminals, vengeful spirits, or accursed beings, could not coexist with the living and must be thrust beyond the boundaries of the known world. In tribal societies, banishment often served as the ultimate punishment, a fate worse than death. Without the protection of kin or tribe, the exiled were left vulnerable to starvation, wild beasts, and hostile spirits. Norse sagas spoke of outlaws like Skarphedin, who became men of the wild, stripped of legal personhood. Celtic law decreed that certain crimes rendered one earback a castaway doomed to wander without fire or shelter. These were not mere legal sentences, but spiritual condemnations, for to lose one's place among men was to lose the favor of the gods. Yet not all who were banished were human. The unseen world teemed with entities that demanded expulsion, restless dead, malevolent spirits, and creatures of the wild that crossed into human domains. The rituals to remove them were intricate, often involving sacred words, symbolic gestures, and the drawing of boundaries that the banished could not cross. In Slavic folklore, villages employed spirit turners to drive away the navik, the souls of those who died untimely deaths. The Greeks buried the dead with coins for Karen, not just as passage payment, but as a bribe to ensure the departed did not linger. The act of banishment was thus both a purification and a surrender. To cast something out was to admit it could not be destroyed, only displaced, and in that displacement lay an unspoken fear, that what was banished might one day return. The power to banish was never solely in human hands. Behind every act of expulsion stood the will of gods and spirits, entities who dictated the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the living and the unwanted. These deities did not merely oversee justice, they embodied the very concept of exclusion, their myths and rituals shaping how mortals understood the act of casting out. In the Norse world, Odin loomed as a god of both wisdom and merciless judgment. Though often depicted as a seeker of knowledge, he was also the patron of exiles, the one who decided who was worthy of Valhalla and who would be condemned to wander. The Einarjar were chosen, but the dishonored dead were left to haunt the edges of the world, unwelcome even in Hell's realm. Similarly, Tyr, the one-handed god of law, presided over oaths and justice, his missing hand a stark reminder that some bonds once broken could never be mended. To be judged by these gods was to face a sentence beyond mortal reproach. The Greeks feared Hecate, the torch-bearing goddess of crossroads, who guided lost souls but also held the power to withhold mercy. At the edges of their cities, offerings were left to her in pits, a ritual known as necromanteon, ensuring the dead stayed where they belonged. Apollo, though a god of light, could bring plague upon those who defied divine order, his arrows striking down the impure until the offending presence was purged. Even the Erinyes, the relentless furies, were both punishers and banishers, hounding oath-breakers until they fled beyond the borders of civilized lands. In Celtic belief, the Morrigan decided the fates of warriors, her crows picking clean the bones of those who fell in battle, but she also gathered the unworthy dead, her spectral host driving them into the wilderness. The Kaleak, the ancient hag of winter, was said to cast out those who displeased her, turning them to stone or burying them beneath storms. These were not distant gods, but active forces, their judgments immediate, and their punishments inescapable. Yet not all banishes were divine. Spirits of the land, the genii loci of Rome, the Vetir of the Norse, the Slavic domovoi, could turn against those who violated their domains. A house spirit, once benevolent, might sour into a poltergeist if wronged, demanding offerings or expulsion. Sacred groves whispered warnings before their guardian struck, and rivers drowned those who crossed them with ill intent. The natural world itself was alive with watchers, enforcers of boundaries that mortals transgressed at their peril. To invoke these gods and spirits in banishment was to call upon forces far older than human law, a curse tablet buried in a grave, a rune carved on a boundary stone, a sacrifice left at a crossroads. Each act was an appeal to powers that had shaped the world long before kings and chieftains claimed dominion. And though the methods varied, the message was the same. There were lines that could not be crossed, and those who did so would be thrust into the dark. Long before written law or structured religion, the act of banishment existed as an instinctive response to threat, a primal recognition that some dangers must be removed rather than destroyed. The earliest evidence of this practice lies not in scrolls or sagas, but in the silent testimony of bones, boundaries, and buried objects. Neolithic communities practiced forms of exclusion that blurred the line between ritual and survival. Mass graves containing bodies pinned beneath stones or bound in unnatural positions suggest post-mortem banishment, ensuring the restless dead could not return. The placement of these burials beyond settlement walls in wetlands or at crossroads reinforced their exile from both the land of the living and the community of properly honored ancestors. The Bronze Age saw the rise of more formalized exclusion rites. In Britain, cursus monuments, long, narrow earthwork enclosures, may have served as ritual pathways for expelling malign forces, their ditches acting as symbolic barriers. Bog bodies preserved across northern Europe reveal darker truths. Many show signs of ritualistic violence before their disposal in liminal spaces. These were not mere murders, but ceremonial removals, their deaths ensuring they would remain trapped between worlds. Proto-Celtic cultures developed intricate boundary magic. The fairy stroke markings found on Irish megaliths, zigzag lines, and concentric circles may have functioned as both warnings and containment spells. Similar symbols appear on Bronze Age weaponry, suggesting warriors sought to banish misfortune from battle. The recurring motif of spirals and passage tombs could represent layers of protection, turning burial sites into sealed domains where the dead were permitted to rest but not return. Among early Germanic tribes, the concept of the unholy emerged, a state of pollution requiring removal. Ritual deposits in lakes and springs included not just offerings, but deliberately broken items, their destruction serving as symbolic banishment of attached spirits. The Scandinavian Horger stone altars often stood at property boundaries, serving as both shrines and points of expulsion where unwanted influences could be transferred out of inhabited space. The oldest banishment rituals shared three universal elements: the marking of boundaries, whether physical or spiritual, the transfer of threat onto a substitute, effigies, sacrificed animals, or inanimate objects, and the act of removal itself, always directed outward, toward wilderness, water, or the underworld. These practices formed the foundation upon which all later pagan banishment traditions would build, their echoes still discernible in folk charms and burial customs millennia later. The spoken word held a sacred and terrible power in ancient pagan traditions, not merely to communicate but to alter reality itself. Banishing incantations were not requests or pleas, they were commands, woven from the same primal forces that had first given shape to the world. To speak of banishment was to unravel an existence, to strip a being of its right to remain in the ordered realm of the living. In the Celtic world, poets and druids wielded the glam disen, satirical verses so potent they could raise boils on the skin of wrongdoers or drive them into exile. The legendary Irish poet Aithern was said to have extorted tribute through the mere threat of his verses, their power lying in their precision, every syllable sharp as a blade. These were not mere insults, but ritualized unbindings of social and spiritual ties. A properly constructed curse could sever a person from their kin, their land, and even their own body, leaving them a walking exile. The Norse tradition knew the power of the nidstung, a curse pole topped with a horse's head, upon which runic spells were carved and spoken aloud. Erected facing an enemy's home, it invoked the wrath of the gods to expel the target from human society. The sagas tell of men who became Vargriveum, wolves in holy places, outcasts so thoroughly severed from humanity that they could be killed on sight. The words that made them so were considered irreversible, their power drawn from Odin's own mastery of runic magic. Greek defictiones, lead-cursed tablets folded and pierced with nails, trapped their targets in perpetual exile. The written words bound the victim's fate to chthonic deities, often specifying they should become a stranger among strangers. These tablets were deposited in graves or sacred springs, their messages carried to the underworld by Hermes Psychopompos. The most chilling examples include not just names but entire genealogies, ensuring banishment extended across generations. Roman execratio rituals turned speech into weaponized law. When the Senate declared an enemy sacer, accursed, priests recited exacting formulae that stripped the target of all legal and divine protections. The condemned became non-persons, their existence erased from communal memory. Vestal virgins performed similar rites against oath breakers, their invocations so precise that a single mispronounced word could nullify the entire banishment. These verbal banishments shared an underlying belief. That language was the first tool of creation, and thus the most potent means of unmaking. A properly constructed curse didn't merely describe exile, it enacted it, weaving the banished one's fate into the fabric of the cosmos itself. The most powerful spells required no physical force. Their speakers became conduits for divine judgment, and their words carried the weight of inevitability. Banishment was never a passive act. It demanded sacrifice, fire, and the deliberate corruption of sacred spaces to force out what could not be tolerated. Across pagan Europe, the rituals shared a common language of transformation, the spilling of blood to break bonds, the burning of effigies to sever connections, and the marking of boundaries that even spirits dared not cross. Blood held a paradoxical role in banishment rites, simultaneously a contaminant and a purifier. Slavic traditions required the sacrifice of a black hen at the threshold of a home to drive out plague spirits, its blood smeared across doorposts as both warning and ward. In Germanic lands, the blot to Odin sometimes involved sprinkling blood in the cardinal directions, not as an offering but as a means of filling the space so no malign force could enter. The Gauls were known to execute criminals at Nemetan sanctuary borders, their deaths serving as both punishment and spiritual barrier, the ultimate human sacrifice rendered inhuman by its location. Fire provided the most irreversible form of banishment. Anglo-Saxon witch bottles filled with nails and urine were hurled into flames to break curses, the act of burning transforming the spell into smoke that dispersed harmlessly. Scandinavian Salugjof rituals burned the belongings of the dead to prevent haunting, the ashes then scattered in running water to carry away any lingering attachment. The Celts practiced ghost firing, where communities would drive cattle between twin bonfires at Samhain, ensuring no spectral riders could follow. A ritual that survived in modified form as Beltane fires well into the Christian era. The drawing of boundaries turned geography into theology. Roman pomerium lines marked the sacred limits of cities, reinforced by annual rituals where priests led sacrificial bulls along the border, their blood soaking into furrows to maintain the division between order and chaos. Lithuanian genii shamans would cut circular trenches around villages during epidemics, filling them with burning juniper to create a quarantine both physical and spiritual. The most potent barriers combined multiple elements, like the Irish practice of burying a dog's skull beneath boundary stones, its spirit bound to guard the perimeter through eternity. These rites shared an understanding that banishment required more than mere removal. It demanded the active corruption of the banished one's connection to the human world. A bloody threshold made a home unrecognizable to the spirits that once haunted it. A burned effigy rendered its subject faceless to both gods and men, and a properly sanctified boundary didn't just mark where something wasn't allowed, it made the other side unseeable to those cast out. The banished didn't leave, they ceased to belong. No act of banishment was complete without its instruments, objects charged with the power to cut, contain, and repel. These were not mere props, but extensions of the banisher's will, crafted from materials the unseen world feared, iron that wounded spirits, thorns that snared evil, and mirrors that trapped malicious gazes. Each tool served as both weapon and ward in the ancient art of expulsion. Iron stood as the universal banishing metal, its very essence antithetical to the supernatural. Celtic smiths forged rods of cold wrought iron to drive off fairies, knowing the touch of unheated metal caused them agony. Norse grave mounds were ringed with iron nails to pin the dead within their barrows, while Slavic peasants hung scythes above cradles so their unyielding edges would sever any curse sent toward a child. The metal's power lay in its refusal to decay, an eternal substance in a mutable world. It anchored the banished thing outside the flow of life. Thorned plants served as nature's barbed wire against evil. Blackthorn staves were carried by British cunning folk to draw protective circles no spirit could cross, their bark inscribed with Ogham curses. Germanic hedge witches wove reeds of bramble and placed them at property boundaries, the tangled spikes acting as spiritual snares. The most feared were the Scandinavian Turnaclubor, thorn clubs, studded with nails, used to beat the ground around haunted sites until the vibrations drove specters into flight. Reflective surfaces turned malice back upon its sender. Etruscan bronze mirrors were buried with the dead to confuse vengeful spirits, their polished faces showing only emptiness to any who peered in. Polish folk traditions placed bowls of black water beneath sickbeds, creating a portal through which illness could be banished. The Greeks polished obsidian into ghost mirrors, knowing the volcanic glass absorbed rather than reflected, a perfect trap for wayward souls. Even everyday objects became weapons in the banisher's hands. Sieves strained out evil when passed over the afflicted, their holes too numerous for curses to follow. Spindles bound malignant forces into inert thread, later burned to ash. Door keys locked away more than physical spaces. Hungarian women would rattle them at midnight to lock out death during plagues. The ultimate power of these tools lay not in their form but in their handling. A kitchen knife could sever spiritual ties as surely as a ritual blade if wielded with proper intent. To hold a banishing tool was to hold a fragment of the primordial forces that first imposed order on chaos. Their efficacy required no elaborate ceremony, only the certainty that they would work. For in the hands of one who truly understood exile's nature, even the humblest object could become a key to oblivion. Human banishment was never the simple matter of expulsion. It was the unmaking of personhood itself. Across pagan Europe, the casting out of individuals followed strict rituals that transformed living men and women into walking dead, their social deaths often more absolute than physical demise. These were not mere punishments, but acts of communal exorcism, purging corruption from the body politic through carefully orchestrated severance. Norse outlawry rites stripped the condemned of all legal humanity. At the things, assemblies, chieftains broke branches to symbolize the outlaw's shattered ties before reciting the formula, "I mark you wolf's head, bear's temper, rootless one." The condemned's property borders were upturned with plows, rendering their land utim, homeless. Most chilling were the Skoganger ceremonies, where outlaws were made to die symbolically, forced to crawl between the legs of relatives as if being reborn into a state beyond kinship. Archaeological finds confirmed the permanence of this status. Several bog bodies showed deliberate mutilation of fingers and teeth, physical markers preventing recognition even in the afterlife. Celtic Fudir outcast rituals focused on sensory deprivation. Exiles were blinded in one eye to have their sight, had one ear notched to impair hearing, and were forbidden to wear shoes, denying tactile connection to land. Irish Brehon law specified that no one should even speak the outcast's name aloud, a prohibition so severe that some legal texts refer to them only as muil, the silent ones. The Ogham stones found along ancient territorial borders often bear not names but curses, warning that those who pass beyond them cease to be remembered. Slavic Izgoi banishments transformed criminals into ritual scapegoats. At the spring equinox, villages would dress offenders in straw coats smeared with tar before driving them into the forest with burning brands. The practice mirrored the later Maslenitsa effigy burnings, both serving to transfer communal ills onto a disposable vessel. Belarusian folk memories preserve the Volkolak rite, where murderers were sewn into wolf pelts before exile, literally becoming the beast their crimes implied. These practices reveal a consistent philosophy. To banish a human required first making them non-human. Whether through legal decrees, physical markings, or ceremonial deaths, the condemned were rendered into abstractions that communities could dispose of without moral consequence. The horror lay not in the act of expulsion itself, but in the meticulousness with which personhood was dismantled, proof that societies feared the banished less for what they had done than for what they might remind others of, that humanity was a fragile construct easily revoked. The pagan world teemed with entities that demanded expulsion. Restless dead who clung to hearths, land spirits turned vengeful, and formless hungers that slipped through the cracks between worlds. Banishing these forces required more than brute force. It demanded an understanding of their origins, their desires, and the precise rituals that could unravel their connection to the living. The dead were the most persistent intruders. Scandinavian Draugr haunted their burial mounds, their physical strength growing with each passing year until whole villages fled. Icelandic Eyrbyggja saga describes the systematic burning of a revenant's corpse, its limbs severed with wolf joint cuts at the knees and elbows before cremation on a pyre of seaweed, ensuring the salt would prevent reanimation. Lithuanian veils required more subtle banishment. Families prepared corpse roads of crushed bone meal, leading away from villages, knowing the dead could resist force but not refuse a path laid by their own remains. Land spirits turned malignant when dishonored. The Celtic Bodach ground dweller would infiltrate homes through improperly sealed foundation stones, bringing sickness until driven out with iron filings and rowan ash paste. Saxon Thur's wards, rune stones carved with Thor's hammer, were placed where buildings disturbed ancient barrows, their inscriptions not pleading but commanding. I break your bones as Thor breaks ice. The most chilling were Alpine Burgeist expulsion rites, where miners would feed territorial spirits with a finger bone from a left hand, the site of betrayal, before sealing mine shafts with lead crosses. Formless evils required creative banishment. Baltic Lama, air spirits, were caught in ritual nets woven from unbleached flax during thunderstorms, then drowned in milk to dissolve their essence. Like Welsh Tafodi drag, dragon's tongue fungus, was burned to purge areas of shadow breath, the residual malice left by violent deaths. Bulgarian folk magic employed thunder scrolls, parchments inscribed during storms then buried under doorsteps, their captured lightning energy repelling night phantoms. These rituals shared a common thread. Successful banishment required first acknowledging the banished one's nature. A ghost could not be expelled until its unfinished business was discovered. A demon would resist unless called by its true name. The most powerful rites often incorporated elements of the entity itself. Grave soil for the dead, a stolen fetish object for a spirit, as both bait and binding. To banish was not to destroy but to rearrange, placing the intruder back in its proper sphere through meticulously reconstructed cosmology. The danger lay in incomplete knowledge, for what was banished without understanding would always find its way home. For all the meticulous rituals and sacred invocations, banishment was never foolproof. The annals of pagan Europe whisper of botched ceremonies, incomplete exorcisms, and entities that refused to stay exiled. These failures carried terrible consequences, not just the return of the banished, but the unraveling of the very protections meant to keep them at bay. Some spirits grew stronger from attempted expulsion. The Norse Mara, night hag, would retaliate against those who tried to drive her away, her visits escalating from nightmares to physical assaults. Icelandic grimoires warned that improperly performed Galder chants could wake the wrong sleeper, attracting attention from far worse entities than the one being banished. A 10th century Swedish burial site contains the skeleton of a woman buried face down with her mouth stuffed with burnt juniper, a clear attempt to rebanish something that had already returned. Certain places resisted cleansing. The Celtic Giesa taboo sites were locations where banishment rituals inverted their effects. Spring waters meant to purify instead amplified curses, and sacred groves intended to contain evil became gateways. The Welsh Caer Ochran legend speaks of a fortress where every exiled criminal mysteriously reappeared at the high table each night, their presence unavoidable as sunset. Archaeological evidence supports these tales. Multiple British hill forts show signs of deliberate abandonment, despite defensive advantages, with vitrified stones suggesting ritual fires meant to seal the sites against something within. Human exiles sometimes returned with unnatural abilities. Irish de Berga, outlaw bands, were said to learn the speech of stones during their banishment, allowing them to summon landslides against their former communities. Slavic Volkovi shamans claimed their power came from surviving attempted banishments, having died symbolically and returned with knowledge from the other side. The most disturbing cases involved Vedder, Scandinavian children exposed at birth who miraculously survived only to return years later with the uncanny ability to summon storms and blight crops. The greatest failure occurred when banishment rituals were too successful. Frisian legends tell of villages that expelled all evil through elaborate year-end ceremonies, only to find their crops wouldn't grow and livestock refused to breed, having accidentally exiled the necessary tensions of existence. A Lithuanian chronicle describes a pagan priest who banished death itself for his people, resulting in a generation that couldn't die but continued aging into unbearable suffering. These accounts reveal the delicate balance pagan societies maintained. Banishment was never about creating perfect safety, but about managing necessary dangers. When performed carelessly, it could rupture the fragile boundaries between the human and non-human worlds, proving that some connections, no matter how dangerous, were never meant to be fully severed. The old rituals worked precisely because they understood this, walking the knife's edge between order and chaos. As pagan Europe faded into history, its banishment rituals did not vanish, they transformed. Stripped of their original theological framework, the old techniques persisted in folk magic, whispered from generation to generation as practical solutions to supernatural problems. What had once been sacred acts became domestic arts. Their power diminished but never entirely lost. Christianity absorbed more than it erased. The Viking Nidstone curse poles reappeared as witch posts in medieval Scandinavian churches, their runes replaced with Bible verses, but their positioning identical. Facing northwest, the direction of pagan hell, Irish monks transcribed Ogham banishment charms onto the margins of illuminated manuscripts, substituting saints' names for old gods while keeping the same verb structures. A 13th century English grimoire from Lancashire prescribes an exact replica of the Anglo-Saxon Wissabannen witch-banning rite, simply prefacing it with in nomine patris. The tools evolved while retaining their essence. Blackthorn staves became walking sticks carved with crosses, still used to mark protective circles. Bog iron, once shaped into spirit blades, was reforged as horseshoes nailed over doors. The Roman practice of depositing curse tablets in springs resurfaced in the Renaissance as wishing wells, where coins took the place of lead scrolls, a sanitized echo of the old transactional magic. Some rituals survived through sheer practicality. Norwegian farmers continued thurs banging, beating boundary stones with hammers to repel frost giants well into the 19th century, long after the original mythology faded. Baltic housewives still sweep floors outward toward the rising sun, a remnant of pre-Christian dawn banishment rites. The Cornish tin miner's prayer, actually a coded banishment chant for underground spirits, was still murmured during World War II when digging air raid shelters. The most telling survivals appear in children's games. The Gaelic Eilidh na Grua Gaish, Hobgoblin's Chase, mimics ancient household banishment rituals with one player as the unwelcome spirit driven out by rhyme and stamping. German Räuber und Gendarme, like cops and robbers, preserves the dynamic of boundary enforcement from pagan outlaw traditions. Even the universal game of tag, with its safe bases and exiled it player, echoes the oldest human understanding of banishment as both punishment and protection. These continuities prove that the old ways never died, they merely learned to speak in the language of new eras. The fundamental human need to define us by casting out them persists, and with it, the shadow of the Severing Rites endures. Modern exorcisms, restraining orders, and even digital blocking functions all follow the same primal pattern. Identify the threat, mark the boundaries, perform the act of removal. The methods change, but the impulse remains, a thread connecting smartphone screens to ancient standing stones. Banishment was never a neutral act. It carried the weight of existential judgment, the moral dilemma of deciding who or what no longer belonged. Across pagan traditions, the question lingered, was expulsion an act of justice or cruelty, protection or fear? The rituals themselves held conflicting answers, revealing societies grappling with the consequences of their own power to exclude. Some banishments were framed as sacred duties. Norse lore held that allowing a draugr to remain unbanished would lead to corpse famine, where the dead consumed the vitality of the living. Celtic Brehon law specified precise conditions under which exile preserved cosmic balance, such as removing a king whose physical blemish, a lost limb or blinded eye, disrupted the symbolic perfection required for sovereignty. In these cases, banishment was not punishment but ecological maintenance, removing spiritual contaminants as one might excise infection from a wound. Yet other traditions acknowledged the act's inherent violence. Slavic Izgoi rituals included a last meal of bread and salt, not as mockery but to ensure the banished took their community's goodwill with them, preventing vengeful returns. Gaulish druids performed memory cuttings before executions where witnesses drank an infusion of mistletoe to blur recollection of the condemned's face, sparing them the indignity of being hated in perpetuity. These gestures revealed an uncomfortable truth. To banish completely required erasing not just a person, but the community's emotional ties to them. The most troubling cases involved banishment of the innocent. Finnish folklore tells of Meninkainen, changeling children, expelled into forests not because they caused harm, but because their differences made them unbearable. Anglo-Saxon Wiccan, wise women, often lived at settlement boundaries, respected for their skills, yet kept at arm's length, their very knowledge rendering them permanently liminal. These examples expose banishment's dark core, its use not against genuine threats, but against whatever a culture feared to confront within itself. Perhaps the deepest ethical tension lay in banishment's irrevocability. While Norse outlawry technically lasted for set terms, sagas reveal most outlaws die before redemption, their sentences effectively eternal. Irish Fuadir status could theoretically be reversed through kinship-washing rituals, yet archaeological finds show many exiles' mutilation marks healed untreated, suggesting permanent abandonment. This finality clashed with pagan Europe's otherwise fluid cosmology, where even gods could be bargained with and fate rewritten. The rituals themselves encoded these ambiguities. Roman execratio curses often included clauses like, "unless you make amends," while Germanic outlaw proclamations specified "until the gods decree otherwise." These loopholes suggest that for all their severity, pagan societies understood banishment as a necessary evil, a tool that protected order while always risking overuse. The true lesson of the old ways may be this: the power to sever comes with the obligation to question when it should and should not be wielded. In the end, the ethics of banishment reduced to a single unanswerable query: does casting out preserve the world or merely shrink it? The pagans left no definitive answer, only thousands of variations on the ritual, each a different attempt to balance safety against mercy, order against compassion. Their legacy is not a solution but a warning. Every act of banishment leaves scars on both the exiled and those who remain. The story of ancient pagan banishments does not conclude. It lingers at the threshold, whispering across time. These rituals were never truly about the exiled, but about those who remained, the communities that drew their identity in negative space, defining themselves by what they cast out. Yet history shows no banishment was ever absolute. What was severed found a ways to return, in memory, in folklore, in the quiet persistence of the unwanted. Archaeology reveals the paradox. Excavated boundary ditches contain offerings deposited long after their original digging, a knife here, a child's shoe there, proof that later generations still felt the need to placate whatever their ancestors had tried to exclude. Norse runestones erected to commemorate outlaws stand not as warnings but as memorials, their inscriptions speaking of loss rather than triumph. The Irish Dinchencha's place name lore preserves tales of exile so vividly that the banished achieve a kind of immortality, their names outlasting those who cast them out. Modernity inherits this tension. Our prisons, deportation policies, and digital block functions followed the same ancient pattern: identify, isolate, remove. Yet like our pagan forebears, we discover that banishment solves nothing permanently. It merely postpones reckoning. The 21st century's cancelled figures find new platforms. Repressed memories resurface as trauma. Borders prove porous to everything except understanding. The old ways offer no easy answers, but they do provide a revelation. Every act of banishment is ultimately self-directed. To declare something intolerable is to admit one's own limits, to acknowledge the fragile boundaries of one's world. Or perhaps this is why the pagan rituals were so elaborate, not because the banished were powerful, but because the banishers needed the ceremony to convince themselves the separation would hold. In the end, the circle remains unbroken. The exiled dead whisper through folk songs, outlaw names surface in genealogy databases, forgotten gods flicker in video game lore. Nothing is ever truly cast out, only moved slightly farther away, waiting for the moment when a threshold weakens, a memory stirs, and the old question must be faced anew: what do we do with what we cannot bear but cannot truly live without? The severing rites endure because they must, not to keep the darkness out, but to remind us it was always part of us.